We've seen pastors arrested for sharing the gospel. Christians are being targeted, and I mean that quite directly, in relation to these laws, these buffer zone laws near abortion clinics. People have been arrested for praying silently, arrested for offering to have consensual conversations with others.
Lorcan Price, thank you so much for joining us. You're from the ADF. Now, this is a kind of Christian charity, is that the right word of putting it? Supporting freedom of speech, supporting Christians around the world. You testified at Congress recently about free speech issues in Britain. Do you think that Britain is in a free speech crisis?
Yes, I do. I think that's kind of trite to say at this stage. That view now is increasingly widely held. My own organisation, we're a religious liberty organisation, that's kind of where we started. So I spent most of my time litigating cases in relation to freedom of religion, particularly at the European Court of Human Rights. But freedom of religion contains an expressive element, so you have to be able to speak in order to kind of change people's religious views, share your beliefs and so on. And in the UK, sadly, over the last number of years, we've seen increasingly that that's been restricted, particularly in public places. We've seen pastors arrested for sharing the gospel. Christians are being targeted, and I mean that quite directly, in relation to these laws, these buffer zone laws near abortion clinics. People have been arrested for praying silently, arrested for offering to have consensual conversations with others. So sadly, and I wish these were isolated incidents, but they're really not. There's a whole pattern across the country, and that's the result of these laws that have been passed, the Public Order Act amendments, the Crime and Policing Act. And whilst people may say they were intended to be neutral or they were intended to deal with a real problem in society, the cumulative effect of them has been to reduce significantly the range of things that you can say in public. And the thinking behind this perhaps is that a more bland, adenine public square is safer for social cohesion and to avoid people from particular groups being offended. But what it's left us with, frankly, is a decisive narrowing of the scope of freedom of religion and frankly of a kind of what I would say is a stunted democracy, because if you're not able to share your views, which is the sine qua non of a democracy, then you're not really able to change people's minds, you're not able to communicate effectively, and a lot of the problems that we're seeing emerging then are kind of pushed underground, as it were, and there's no outlet for conversation.
You talked about the government targeting Christians specifically. Do you think that there is a real anti-Christian campaign to try and shut down Christian voices, shut down Christian prayer, that has this kind of motivation from a religious perspective or secular perspective?
Well, taken together, this is what these laws constitute. Some of them are directly anti-Christian. So in Bournemouth, for example, the local authority there has adopted, under the powers delegated to it by the Crime and Policing Act, a buffer zone that expressly talks about reading scripture, making signs of the cross, blessing oneself. So those are Christian activities, and they're expressly prohibited by the law in that local authority. So that's directly anti-Christian, I would say. But moreover, or in addition rather, some of the examples of street preachers I think are very apt to this point, because they are directly engaged in sharing their religious beliefs. They often ask for conversations with members of the public. We can take the case of Pastor Dia Moodley in Bristol, I think is a really good indicative case of this. He was surrounded by a group of young men who said they were Muslim. They asked him about the differences between Christianity and Islam. He was happy to talk about that. As a result of that, he was assaulted by them. Somebody called the police. So, and there are a number of other incidents I can describe to you. But as I say, taken together, it looks like what emerges is a kind of a very much an anti-Christian trend. And I think that shouldn't be surprising in one way, because what Christianity has to say are radically provocative things to the culture. And I mean provocative not in a pejorative sense, but in a challenging sense. So what Christianity has to say on sexual and moral ethics is powerful. It's countercultural. What it has to say as well about the lordship of Christ over all other considerations is powerful. It's provocative to other religions, and if the motivating intention of the authorities is to try and prevent anyone feeling upset or to try and create a very, as I say, sanitized public square, then Christianity, of course, will find itself being particularly restricted because of that challenging nature of its message.
You mentioned Ramadan there. It's fascinating. To what extent do you think that these laws and these restrictions on freedom of speech is to do with trying to appease Muslims, trying to appease other minorities, other religions in Britain that have come in recent years?
There is certainly an element of that. It can't be dismissed. There's a concept when we think about freedom of speech issues called a heckler's veto, and the notion that if somebody can be sufficiently provoked or offended or upset by something, that their complaints essentially veto your right to be able to speak. When we're talking about Islam in this context and the assaults against preachers that I'm aware of, many of them, disproportionate number of them are from the Islamic community, that constitutes a type of heckler's veto. It's essentially saying that the whole concept and the kind of raison d'etre behind public order law is to keep the public order, to keep calm, to keep peace. And so if you have somebody who is engaged in preaching, they're saying things that are provocative, and some people take offense, then immediately order is upset, and the person taking offense then can complain that what's being said by the Christians so upsetting, so provocative that they have to respond forcefully, and therefore the police needed to intervene in order to maintain or re-establish the equilibrium of public order. That heckler's veto and that challenge to Christianity that comes kind of aggressively is from Islam, and the police, in trying to restore the balance as they see it, have sided with the Muslims on more than one occasion. And I think that's extremely unfortunate. No group or community should be able to use the threat of force or actual force to silence the views of others in this way.
Do you think Britain has de facto blasphemy laws when it comes to Islam? We've seen some cases of people burning the Quran, for example, where the police have intervened, or this teacher in Batley, maybe you can talk a bit about him. And just an adjacent question to that, do you think we should have blasphemy laws when it comes to Christianity?
Well, I'm not sure that with the blasphemy law, the intention of the authorities is to protect the dignity or the name of God. That's not quite the intention here. So I can understand that people say it is de facto, but not de jure, a blasphemy law. But I think it's more a law aimed at trying to ensure that this patchwork, this multicultural, multi-ethnic patchwork we have, remains as stable as possible, and therefore nobody should be allowed to do anything that's excessively provocative to one community or another. So I'm not sure that they want to protect, as it were, the honor of the Prophet or of Islam, but they want to make sure that the people who do strongly believe in that are not provoked into a reaction. So in a way, I think it becomes that.
So it's out of fear?
Yes, quite frankly. It's out of fear, and even that remark from the arresting officer in Bristol was like, the implication of it to Pastor Moodley was, you should have known better than to preach during Ramadan. You're only going to provoke people who will then assault you. And so there's a very deep problem we have with policing in the United Kingdom, and we've heard a lot about this discourse in relation to two-tier policing. I think there's a lot to that, but more deeply, over the last couple of decades, the way in which the police are trained in conflict resolution and so on has been to prioritize what you can identify, let's say, are communities that are historically oppressed and so on, and that they need to be defended in the first instance against insult or provocation.
When it comes to the laws governing the abortion centres, I know this is something that you've obviously talked about, helped fund cases of Christians who are silently praying near abortion centres. So the argument goes that this is provoking and harassing women who have a right to abortion, healthcare, clinic, whatever. And that by protesting against these people, you're intimidating them, you're making them feel uncomfortable, you're causing them offence for doing something that they feel that they have the right to do. So how do you respond to, look, you can pray wherever you want, but just not near these abortion clinics because these women have the right not to be harassed?
Well, I'll take that in two parts. The first is the notion that they are being harassed by this conduct, silent prayer or offering consensual conversation. And then the choice of the person who's praying. Why do they pray it there? So the first element of that, what I would say in response to it is harassment and intimidation and any kind of obstruction. Those things historically have been illegal. We have a harassment act in the United Kingdom. And I and my organisation would be completely opposed to any behaviour like that. And indeed, the people we represent are as well, for two reasons. First of all, it's illegal, but it's also counterproductive to the intention that they have, which in many ways is to either bear witness to what they regard as the injustice of abortion, or to offer a consoling or helpful conversation to somebody who might be considering an abortion. So it's not something they would consider doing. It's not something that would actually help the outcome they intend, which is for a woman to reconsider terminating her pregnancy and having an abortion. As to the second element then, about the proximity to the clinics, there's a couple of sub-points I would make there. The first is that these buffer zones are not tightly drawn around the clinics. They're enormous. They're the size of a football stadium. In the case of Bournemouth, for example, where Adam Smith-Connor has been prosecuted for praying silently. So it's over 300 meters, and you're talking about whole streets essentially blocked, well, not blocked, but encompassed within the buffer zone. So if it was to allow access to the clinic, and there was, let's say, a legitimate, even though I don't agree with this, but in the case of Bournemouth, a legitimate contention that access was being obstructed, then you can design something that is strictly outside what they call the curtilage of the building, precisely beside it. That's the case here in the United States. There's a federal law that protects the immediate access and egress points to abortion clinics. So that's not what we've done in the United Kingdom. So it's overbroad. But why do people pray there is the question. For Catholics in particular, prayer connected with a physical place in time and space is very important. You'll often see, and that's not just something that Catholics, or Christians prioritize, but even people themselves will lay a memorial at the site of an accident. They'll gather where something has happened that they regard as unjust or wrong or tragic. And for Christians, what's happening in abortion clinics is a great tragedy, it's a great injustice, it's a great moral wrong. And so being proximate to that is important, not out of an intention to intimidate, because again, that'd be completely counterproductive. And moreover, from a prayerful perspective, it wouldn't necessarily be something, considering the nature of prayer, which is your thoughts directed towards God. If your thoughts are directed in a manner which is designed to intimidate or upset somebody, it's not conducive to anyone's proper understanding of the concept of prayer. So praying there is both to be in proximity to a place that you believe an injustice has occurred or that a tragedy is occurring, and it's also then to, as it were, raise your thoughts to God in that vicinity.
I want to come back to this idea of blasphemy laws, and whether in your kind of ideal Christian nation society there should be strict restrictions on freedom of speech when it comes to offending Christians or whatever. And also, where do you draw the line in terms of freedom of speech? I presume you're not a freedom of speech absolutist, or maybe you are.
Well, I'm not. I'll start there. I don't think that's all rights. Almost all rights have boundaries where you reach a point where, in order to have a functioning society, there has to be a certain delineation of people's rights, particularly where they clash. Freedom from torture is probably an example of one that doesn't. It's an absolute right. I would say the right to life is absolute, but alas, in international law and domestic law, over the years we've seen it eroded, both at the very beginning and the very end. With speech, that is a qualified right. So I shouldn't be allowed to defame you, bring your reputation into disrepute untruthfully. I shouldn't be allowed to incite violence against you or against others. There are other classic offences in the common law called the inchoate offences. So conspiracy, shouldn't be allowed to organise or engage in the planning of an indictable offence. Conspiracy, I think, is one that people often forget in this discussion. So, and incitement to violence, obviously, as I mentioned. I believe that those are long-standing traditions in our law and the common law, and they're long-standing prohibitions. Incitement to hatred, though, is something totally new, and frankly, I think legally ill-defined, a political tool, in my honest opinion.
And being grossly offensive, this bizarre, subjective phrase that is used from the Communications Act.
Yes. I mean, the problem with the reason they put grossly in there is that there's a famous decision from the European Court of Human Rights in 1976 called Handyside versus the United Kingdom, where the court explicitly said that you're allowed to be offensive. So the response to that was just don't be grossly offensive. But again, I mean, these terms, and this is one of the reasons I find that, incitement to hatred is a concept that can be very clearly identified, incitement to violence is a concept that can be clearly identified in law, and there's a long-standing jurisprudence on it. Incitement to hatred, the parameters of it are so vague that it offends against a rule that we have in the common law, which is that where it comes to a criminal offence, it should be explicitly clear to allow you to be able to control your conduct so that you don't wander into committing a crime. But with these terms like grossly offensive communications or stirring up hatred, that's gone. But to your question over the ideal Christian nation, the notion of blasphemy as it was, because in a Christian nation, and most of our nations were, where there was an established church and a head of, a king who was anointed by the established church, the reason for blasphemy was that you were protecting the entire order in which society was grounded, which was ultimately license from God or permission from God through the institutions that are established for the proper governance of a people. So the church and the king, and then through the king, parliament, or whatever particular way it was set up. And if you struck at the heart of that by, as it were, speaking all kinds of infamy and calumny against God, then you were striking at the heart of the whole order. And so it wasn't, as some people kind of naively think, to protect God's feelings, or even the feelings of the religious adherents listening to it. It was designed really to try and understand that the type of societies that we used to have, it was cohesive, it was all of a whole with, under the lordship of the Christian God, of Christ. As we've moved away from that decisively, particularly after the Reformation, the rationale for blasphemy really has fallen away. I think my own country, the Republic of Ireland, was the last place in Western Europe, at least, to have it encoded in the Constitution, and that was since removed. And it was never prosecuted. There was some kind of suggestion that Stephen Fry was going to be prosecuted at one point for blasphemy under it. However, it remained as a relic of an understanding of a political order that was essentially Christian.
So no more Inquisition. We're not going to bring that back.
Well, who knows what the future holds. We have a different type of Inquisition now, of course. It's to determine whether somebody was offensive or grossly offensive.